hello, Rachel. Thank you for being with us. And thank you so much for sharing with us your really important and great film, Infractions, which is about the struggles of the First Nation people in the Northern Territory of Australia against the gas fracking. And my first question would be, why was it necessary to make a film about gas fracking and the struggles against it?
I trained as a museum curator, and after, I mean, we've been living through an unceasing mining boom that never ends. And the fracking industry, when it was approved onshore for development in Australia, actually was first approved in the harbour that I grew up on, where my family owned a fishing store. My father's side were all kind of union organisers, so I knew the Gurungrung elders in the film. I knew them through kind of family history, I guess. And it was extremely obvious in the first 4 years of the resistance to the fracking industry in Western Queensland, which was about an hour away from the capital city museum where I was curating film. It was all white farmers on television complaining about their property being, property value being destroyed, and because of the weakness of land rights in Queensland, which has one of the most kind of violent frontier histories. But it's also that area where the white farmers were highly active, is also like infamous for Indigenous resistance to pastoralism. So this kind of image of, corporate invasion, shall we say, had, no history in terms of the history of that land. And that was because, the First Nations people who were struggling in those places were also dealing with native title legislation, which, when they're in negotiation with the mining company to get compensation from those companies, they actually can't speak in public to the media about the situation that they're in. So there were no Indigenous voices on TV at all for the first 5 years. And at the same time, my workplace and many workplaces in the capital cities were actually sponsored by those fracking companies, and no one in the cultural industry was saying anything about it at all. So as someone who has been working alongside Aboriginal curators since the 80s onwards, and promoting Aboriginal art, in institutions, not as a curator, but as someone who's working in the same institutions that are promoting Aboriginal art, I think there's a kind of onus on cultural workers to talk about the land that those practices come from, and to show a bit more commitment to the connectivity of land and cultural work in a country that is built on stolen wealth, basically. So that's kind of how I started, but then I continued because even the last documentary on national TV 3 weeks ago still didn't interview any of the First Nations activists that they even filmed the protests of when they're talking about the feasibility of the industry. Having said that, there is a very important film called Water is Life by SEED, which is the Aboriginal Youth Climate Group, that was made before my film. And I watched that film over and over again to think about what I was going to add separate to their work. And a lot of what my film is about is having non-Indigenous people understand the legal situation that people are in, and what the Indigenous legal critique is of the fracking industry. Most people in the film are connected to a group called the Protect Country Alliance, which is the anti-fracking group of the Northern Territory. The people I'm most connected to are the women on the Gladstone Harbour, and the whole that, they're now connected to the people in the film by a pipeline, but in terms of the history of Indigenous organising and connectivity, they're all, they know people who know people who know people. So it's not just a pipeline that's connecting people, right? But it's important to say that I didn't actually pick any of the activists in the Northern Territory to be in my film. They were recommended as people who already, have the authority to speak up for their country, and were already speaking to journalists who were interested in representing their voices in a kind of broader field. And I met some of those people when I was invited to an event called Stories from the Frontline, that was looking in particular about how artists how artists and art institutions could be utilised a bit more strongly to raise the kind of voices of the First Nations against fracking. They're all really happy with it. They're all really busy organising every day. So we took it back to Darwin and Mapantwe, Alice Springs. And Q got to kind of report back on her experience of the launches in Berlin and London to the local community there. The reaction from First Nations viewers has been really solid, and you know, it's partly because they all knew what footage was going to be. You know, I played the footage on the second tour that I did when I was making the film, so they knew which you know, they knew what their contribution was before they saw the final cut. The final cut got edited according to people's feedback. And then the tour was a bit difficult under COVID because, I mean, obviously First Nations are higher risk, and even though there hasn't been much of the virus here in the beginning phases when we were touring the film, you know, that could have been an issue. So we did a bit more remote conversation, which has actually been good for people's voices getting out into places that they may not have been before those kind of tech setups were experimented with. So the Protect Country Alliance has done a lot of work, and I really am just kind of amplifying the work that that group is doing, but trying to send more audiences that already value Aboriginal art towards Aboriginal activism. We're dealing with a corporate mediascape that's, you know, something like 65% Murdoch owned. So a lot of the news around the industry continues to be about the politics of price and the feasibility, the economic feasibility, which is extremely irrational. There's no, the industry doesn't add up if you actually want to consider how much the government is actually subsidising it. So even apart from how much emissions it threatens. But in terms of the, you know, that local conversation, interestingly, my grandfather, you know, got jobs for Aboriginal workers on the kind of Gove alumina refinery in the 80s, and so the, you know, what the conversation that we've had is about the local Indigenous history of labour, around major, you know, the kind of corporate history of my hometown, and also kind of engaging with the local museum that I think could be doing a lot more work with First Nations communities, and trying to kind of normalise that kind of everyday consultation around Aboriginal history in that town. I was particularly interested in when the fracking industry first installed it, it needed to dredge the harbour to make way for bigger gas ships, and millions of fish died, and turtles and dugongs, from the impact of the dredging. And, you know, a lot of the stories, you know, if you're a school kid in that town, you've never been told the Indigenous stories of that harbour, and, you know, until the 2000s, and it's still only, you know, those ladies in my film that would go around and do that. So, you know, making sure that they continue to be invited to the institutions, and that the institutions understand that the significance of that actually is kind of international, I think is really important, even though it's an extremely small town and an extremely kind of normalised industrial zone. It's a settler colony, so it's an ongoing, you know, it's ongoing work. There have been major reviews of the industry based on you know, so there is a huge anti-fracking movement in the Northern Territory in particular, because of the history of land rights there and the strength of people still in their country. It is extremely Aboriginal led, so there's significant consultation of the activist scene with all those activists. You know, you only see obviously a small fragment of the First Nations people fighting in my film. But yeah, you know, it's the main issue is it's a very large area to struggle around infrastructure in. So people power is massively kind of dispersed, and the energy, you know, people aren't just fighting the fracking industry, they're fighting racist policies across the board. I wanted to pay attention in the film to, or at least hint at the issue of water, because I think, well, it's not, I think, you know, in the context of the government's interest in improve the fracking industry, they're trying to privatise the water across the whole of the north of Australia, and make it available to more corporations, not just mining companies, but also mega agricultural experiments. So, you know, there's a kind of imperial geography there. They've always wanted to develop the north. It's never happened before. And then in the context of, you know, these new kind of experimental mining industries, it's almost an excuse to turn that back into the extractive zone that they always wanted it to be. So it's that kind of, you know, like a lot of the settler activist films are really all about the unprecedentedness of the industry, whereas once you're, you know, foregrounding those First Nations defences of land and water, you know, it's just it's a series of layers that also is part of the tactical literacy of people, because they've beaten, you know, they've been fighting off, you know, corporate interests from their land for a long time, and they've been dealing with toxic water for a long time. And so it's less an event than it is, you know, a next kind of layer of things to kind of resist. But it is happening, but it's just, you know, there's amazing collaborations in relationship to legal activism. There's people, you know, working with painters, and there's people working with, you know, all across the institutions. Various things are happening. It's just about continuing to kind of put some effort in and, you know, assume that it does something, I guess. That's a really hard question. I mean, I think, you know, it's important to say I've been in conversation for a very long time with the Garang aunties, but the activists in the Northern Territory, I actually really concertedly wanted to waste as little of their time as possible, which is also about, you know, being introduced to the right people who, you know, had the, you know, the experience to kind of deal with me and then send me off to do the edits according to their wishes. So, yeah, a lot of that, I guess, you know, I guess I would describe myself as a cultural worker who's committed to truth-telling around colonial history and Aboriginal, you know, Aboriginal political and art history. The connection between art and politics in Australia is, you have to do a lot of work and, you know, conversing with people, you know, who do that work to feel like you have anything to contribute. So I've only made that film after 20 years of, you know, writing, you know, history of Aboriginal art and activist practices in conversation with my colleagues. And I wouldn't recommend anyone, you know, start from scratch in that regard. But it is, you know, it is the case. I don't know if you know, there was an exhibition called Rautenstrauch-Joest-Museum that happened in Germany in the 80s. That was the last major exhibition of Aboriginal art that was actually curated by Aboriginal land rights activists. And so the history that I'm allegiant to, you know, is you know, that continuing the obvious need to support those land rights activists regardless of their success in courts, you know, in colonial courts, I guess, because it's the ongoing project of erasure that also needs to be fought, which is how, you know, non-Indigenous people can contribute, but they need to definitely always check the facts because the books are often wrong, right? So yeah, I think, you know, depending on what the project is, I mean, I knew I could contribute to this project as a cultural worker because it was about my hometown and it was affecting Aboriginal people who my family have known intergenerationally for some time. And if it was a different situation, you know, I probably wouldn't do it. But so it's about choosing the things you feel like you have something to contribute, while also kind of supplementing the power and the speech of Indigenous expertise. And that's really how, you know, the only real decision I made that was mine in terms of protagonist was asking Professor Irene Watson to be involved, who kind of has that meta-narrative position in the film, to explain, you know, the Indigenous critique of the settler legal system, which I think is important for people to understand, that actually supporting activism is the only way that this is going to be shut down. So, you know, activists on the ground, but also shareholder activists between, not just in Australia, but also in Germany and the UK. There's lots of European banks invested in Australian gas and minerals at the moment. So yeah, the entanglements are global, but how we kind of bite off a piece to chew is really the kind of practice question. There's a group called the Gastivists in Berlin and across multiple European cities who are thinking through the problem, you know, this global connected problem of global gas. So there's definitely local groups to be involved in if they're affected by the film and they want to contribute, you know, to the decolonial fossil fuel project from where they are.
Dear Rachel, thank you very much for the interview. Thanks.
Thank you.